On this episode of the Dairyland Initiative podcast, we're going to be talking about behavior around transition. Hi, I'm Courtney Hallbach.
And I'm Nigel Cook.
And this is the Dairyland Initiative podcast,
where we get to discuss issues related to the housing and management of dairy cattle.
Let's dive in. We figured that it might be worthwhile to change focus away from ventilation in cow and calf barns and focus a little bit on behavior around transition.
No calves in this one then.
Oh, wait, really? There's got to be something to do with calves.
We might sneak a little bit of heat stress in here, folks, but no calves this time.
All right. So we're going to go down memory lane, even though Dr. Cook didn't want me to say memory lane, and look a little bit at transition cows.
We are. We're going to focus on the cow in transition and some of our experiences learning how to apply what we know about cow behavior to facility design and management through transition, retaining that core concept of the Dairyland Initiative of building from the cow up.
I like how this sounds.
20 years ago, Courtney.
You don't want to know how old I was.
Yeah. My first experiences of cows in America, this cow here was on a farm that my colleague Gary Etzel took me to for my interview.
So this cow is an AI generated?
No, this is a real cow.
Oh, okay.
It was the biggest cow I'd ever seen.
I think it's the biggest cow I've ever seen, too.
She was a dry cow out in a lot, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She's enormous. For those that are listening to this, there's a picture of a cow that must be about 8 feet wide.
Probably.
Yeah, she's huge. And I think that really takes us back to where transition cow research was 20 years ago. So the primary focus way back was on body condition score, hence the picture of that enormous cow. Dry matter intake, maximizing dry matter intake, and maximizing energy.
I'm hearing some things where that probably led to poor health in transition cows.
Well, the problem was a lot of that research was done in tie stalls. One cow at a time, little tie stall, feed in front of her. And that wasn't the reality of farming at that time. We were transitioning from tie stalls into these larger freestall dairies. And when we applied that knowledge and that advice, health was an absolute disaster in our dairies at that time. Steve Stewart showed this slide at a meeting around then, and we were blown away. This was before a time that we monitored early lactation turnover. I think we talk about turnover in the first 60 days in milk pretty commonly now.
Yeah.
Before this slide, we didn't. He showed us that 20% of the cows removed were leaving the herd in the first 60 days.
Wow.
Blew our minds. Largely related to health problems.
Events.
Yeah. So a fifth of all culling was happening before cows had much of a chance to make any milk. Problem.
That's a big problem.
A little bit of an indicator that what we were doing for transition cows wasn't working. So there's lots of hypotheses, lots of metabolic changes occurring at the start of lactation, and researchers were very much focused on things like hypocalcemia, clinical and subclinical, focused on ketosis. And you can develop a very nice cascade where you can kind of link the two, related to smooth muscle gut function, risks for displaced abomasums, fat mobilization in late gestation, imposing lowered dry matter intake and increased risk for ketosis. And evidence that the combined effect of subclinical hypocalcemia, increased risk of ketosis, led to reduced milk yield and increased disease. So that was the cascade. And in intervening years, we've kind of learned it's a bit more complicated than that. We've got sort of inflammation, immune function, issues going on, probably related to these metabolic diseases. But depending on where you were as a researcher, you were kind of either focused in one area or another area.
I was going to say, did the shift then go to re-examining nutrition or facilities or management?
Right. Well, if you were a nutritionist, you were revisiting nutrition. So Ken Nordland and I put a book together, a selection of chapters, and asked Rick Grummer to contribute a chapter on what he thought was going on here. And he was very much an energy, dry matter intake guy. And we saw lots of models of the impact of body condition score on this reduction in intake in the last few days before calving. You could commonly see that sort of graph of dry matter intake decreasing to the point of calving and then recovering afterwards. But what he was able to show was that this explanation through what we knew, parity, diet, body condition score, really only explained about 18% of the variation that he was seeing in dry matter intake.
I'm kind of surprised it's so low.
You know, that was the predominant focus. You know, everything's going there, all of the research dollars, all of the interest, and we're only explaining
18%.
Less than a fifth of what's going on, which really begged the question that maybe the high intake, low NDF, high energy approach wasn't the right approach to take in the field. You know, take the cow out of the tie stall and put her in a group situation. And perhaps an approach where you limited intake by increasing dietary fiber, maybe that had merit.
All right.
So he was kind of amongst the first to sort of raise that as a topic, and Jim Drakely's group really kind of followed through with that in Illinois, showing that he had some concerns about what was happening not only in the close-up dry period within 20 days of calving, but in the far dry group as well.
60 days out from calving?
60 days out. He was showing that there was a negative impact on peripartum metabolites and health. When you overfed that group, you were kind of setting them up for failure. And this was the paper here, and just to look at the date, 2011, that was the first sort of the bulky diet, the high NDF, the Goldilocks diet, lots of straw in the diet, where we were controlling prepartum energy intake.
That was only 13 years ago.
Yeah, you come in on all this, this good stuff.
Yeah, come in at the right time
but,
into the dairy
it's
industry.
It's not been around that long, Courtney. And so they got the first data showing the reduced incidence of health problems.
Okay.
And hard to do that because you have to have a lot of animals in your study to show an impact on health. And he was able to do that. So all power to Jim on that one. So in that same book that we were inviting these chapters, Ken and I put this basically review of what we understood about cow behavior through transition. We put all that information together and we started to think about the something else, you know, the 80% of the variation. What could that be due to other than dietary factors? So this little diagram here represents 4 farms that our team had visited. Gary Utzel was going out doing nutrition investigations. Ken was doing health investigations. I was looking at cow behavior and lameness and stall design and so on. And we came back and we were just struck by what was happening on these freestalled areas in terms of managing the cow around calving time. Because we hadn't had to do that in a tie stall. In a tie stall, you had a cow in a stall and it calved there, or you had a bedded pack at the end of the barn and they calved there. And the dry cows were either outside or on a bedded area somewhere. So one farm, for example, moved the cow 1 to 3 times between 20 days before and 20 days after calving. Another farm moved them 5 times, and this farm moved them 6 times.
Jeez.
6 pen moves within 40 days.
Did they just like moving cows?
They were moving cows to management, what we kind of described as, you know, we had all these different diets because the research told us that we needed to focus on diet, and so we moved them from far dry to close-up, and then as the herds expanded, that close-up pen wasn't big enough, so we moved them to another close-up pen. And then we moved them to a maternity pen to calve in, and then maybe a colostrum pen to get the milk that had antibiotic residues, and then a fresh pen, and then a lactating cow pen.
Jeez.
All different diets, all different management focus. And we were looking at going, this cannot be good.
No.
But we had no research done on cow behavior during transition. This is 2004. before you were born, Courtney.
No, I was born by this time, Dr. Cook.
Okay, you were born, but quite young.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not very long ago.
Mm-hmm.
We had research on mid-lactation cows being moved between groups.
Okay.
And I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment. So we knew what happened
Later.
with non-transition cows, and it wasn't necessarily good. And then we had overstocking, which was the topic of our previous podcast.
Yep.
We were building lots of 3-row pens. 3-row pens, 3 rows of stalls per 2 feed spaces. So, automatically overstocking the bunk area.
And it makes sense because it's usually more cost effective to build a 3-row.
Cheaper to build.
barn.
And we didn't understand how cows ate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't really understand much about feeding behavior. We just saw all this space and thought it was available to the cows. And then we were doing work on lameness and mattresses and sand and thinking, well, that's probably a challenge when the cows are calving as well. Yeah. So lots of thoughts in this chapter, not a hell of a lot of data.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness our friends at British Columbia were actually doing proper research at that time. So they were amongst those that reported on lactating cows and what happens when you move them between groups. And it's the moved cows change behavior and become more active and restless within the first 2 days after a pen move. And then things kind of settle down.
Yeah, it looks like
So it's a sort of 48-hour period of restlessness. Meeting and greeting, re-socializing, working
figuring
out
out
who's
who's
who.
the boss.
Exactly. Social hierarchy. Remember, cows are hierarchical animals. So this is important. And while they're doing that, they're not eating and they're not lying down and they make less milk. Yeah. So of the order of 9 pounds or 4 kilos less milk on the day after regrouping because of this kind of stress.
But again, this was for
Lactating cows.
Yeah, lactating cows.
And there was a famous Japanese study, Hasegawa, I can remember. Ken and I kind of reading that paper and chatting about that and thinking, this applies to transition cows. Did a great job of showing what was happening. So we started to think, well, how are these herds managing the cows in these transition cow pens? And in some of the pens, like maybe a close-up pen, you might fill that pen once a week.
And when you say close-up, are you saying 7 days from calving?
21 days before.
Okay.
Yeah, typically 21 days before, sometimes 30. There's a bit of variation. And so this is the social turmoil profile for 2 days of restlessness and then 5 days of calm. Okay. So you'd put that together, and for the 3 weeks that you're in that pen, or 3 or 4 weeks, most of your time would be spent in relative calm. Yeah. But it would be interspersed by brief periods of meeting and greeting. Let's put it that way. So we would think, okay, let's try to manage filling those pens just once a week with larger groups of animals where they can kind of pal up. So the moved in group has some friends.
Yeah.
And it would be less stressful. But you compare that to pens, and we had maternity pens, extended stay maternity, or close-up pens, where animals are being added daily.
I'm seeing less and less time where we just have status quo.
So you stack that up and you start to think, oh my God, in those pens, these cows are just constantly under this sort of social turmoil, constantly meeting and greeting and working out who's and who. And we just thought, this cannot be good. This can't be good. And so we envisaged, we went to farms where you had a big old bedded pack for the entire 21, 30 days before calving. And we said, well, why not just split that up? Instead of having one big area, maybe have 3 smaller areas and keep the cows together for that time. So that was the first kind of application of saying, okay, if social turmoil is a problem, can we create some social stability by operating multiple smaller pens where the cows stay together longer versus just keep adding cows?
And, in this picture here, are you just saying cows come in into one pen, stay there until they calve, or are they moving between those 3 pens?
Yep, they don't move. They just go into a pen and they stay there for the entire period together, and they just carve out of that pen.
And I know you said no calves in this episode, but this kind of sounds like all in, all out for calf facilities.
There's a familiarity to it, Courtney, isn't there?
Yeah, so which came first, transition cows or the calves?
Transition cows. These things are ultimately applicable even across species. You know, you start to look at how swine facilities are run, how poultry facilities are run. All of these elements are the same. So it took until 2011. This is, again, our friends at UBC. Finally, we had a regrouping study done
For transition cows.
This is in the pre-fresh period.
Okay.
And they, again, really elegantly showed the drop in dry matter intake, about a 9% decrease in dry matter intake in the moved cows. The cows that were in the pen were relatively unaffected.
Okay.
It's the cows that move in that are affected by the move. So this was, kind of supportive of all those sleepless nights and worries that we had that this was applicable for our transition cows. So on the feeding side, we basically kind of said, well, yes, all these rations are wonderful, but rations only work when cows get to eat them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, we'd commonly see pictures of the bunk full of cows, but then cows standing in the rear, not having access, whether there was insufficient space or, in this case, because you have big dominant cows that are able to keep subordinates away.
In a post and rail
which
system.
Tends to happen in a post and rail versus a headlock or feed stall situation. And at the time, the thought was not to worry. These cows just... They'll get there later.
Yep.
Yeah. So they'll work it out. That's what we thought.
Yeah.
Not very long ago.
The research says otherwise.
Well, you start to look at how that bunk is utilized. So this is the proportion of feed spaces, headlocks if you like, or sections of 24 inches or 30 inches. You look at how that feed bunk gets used through the day. There are periods of intense activity where up to 80% of the bunk is full of cows.
And I'm guessing that's around when fresh feed is delivered?
Fresh feed is delivered, when the cow group comes back from milking, and oftentimes the farmer will push up feed under those circumstances. But those peaks kind of tail away fairly quickly within the hour or so. And the most of the time, for the rest of the day, the feed bunk has about 25-30% fill. So it's not... you can't think that people were terribly wrong working on the assumption that, well, if there's 70% of the feed space is still available, then if you didn't get to eat here, you just went and got it later.
Yeah.
That's what we thought. But as you watch cows and you kind of understand their behavior, we go all the way back to one of our first episodes where we talked about their sort of allelomimetic behavior, their
Still
desire.
Can't say that word.
Allelomimetic. They want to do the same thing at the same time. So you saw a cow, pushing her way in here, and rarely you will actually get a section of, 10-foot, 5 headlocks, and you'll get 5 cows all squidged in there. More commonly, it's just 4 because, we made 24-inch headlocks because 5 of them fit in a 10-foot span, which was pretty much what we had available. Nobody asked the cow whether 24 inches was enough, and you can kind of see from here how crammed they are. Maybe it wasn't enough, and our growing concern was, what about the cows that don't get access to that fresh feed? And so it went all the way here to 2004. This is Trevor DeVries's work, looking at some new technology that could measure bunk activity. So these numbers represent sort of feed space hits as the cow kind of put her head over the bunk. So we've got feeding activity at a 0.5 meter per cow versus 1 meter per cow, which again in imperial were basically talking about...
I feel like 24 inches and 48 inches?
Something like that. Yeah. But the bottom line is, you have dominant cows that have plenty of feeding activity. So we've got a number of 300 here when they've got lots of space. And when they've got less space, it's the same. They eat the same. They get what they want when they want it. But the slope of that line tells you that there are cows down here that have fairly decent feeding activity when they have lots of feed space, and half that activity when you shrink the space. So those are the subordinate animals that are getting pushed out. So when you shrink the space, they don't get to the feed at that time. Okay, so it's telling you that the effect of shrinking bunk space is different for different animals.
Yep.
There are cows that don't care. They're dominant. They get what they want. There are animals that are getting pushed out.
So how can we as managers help those subordinate cows?
That's the question. Do we need to? Do they work it out? Do they go and eat more later on? Or do we have to intervene? And the intervention would be give them more space.
Yeah.
That's the obvious one. Or make sure that we push the feed up and we do things to sort of trigger repeated bunk attendance. So delivering fresh feed more often, strategically pushing that feed within the hour of delivery so that we can extend that primary feed peak of when cows are getting access to that feed.
Yeah.
So we had some growing evidence that it did impact health and milk production. So this was Gary Ertzel's study done on a commercial dairy with a very nice 2-row pre-fresh pen. And they had heifers and cows mixed together. But they very conveniently went through phases where they overstocked that pen and understocked it, as most farms do. And what Gary was able to show was that in the heifers, the first lactation heifers, not the older cows, that overstocking here at about 120%, and we've talked about that magic 120%. So even at 120% in a 2-row pen, these heifers were losing over 500 pounds of milk in the first 85 days in milk.
Wow.
So he was able to show that in groups of animals, and this is the sort of de facto low-rank cow is your first lactation heifer in a group with older cows, that those animals lose milk. And then we were sent this dairy comp slide from Dr. Paul Meager, a practitioner in Wisconsin who's battling with a 800 cow dairy, trying to improve transition cow performance. And he'd regrouped cows, he'd done lots of things, and they finally just said, okay, let's give the group more bunk space. And this graph is kind of in reverse. This is the most historic, but all these dots are cows' first test ME305 milk. So it's their 305 milk production. And this is the point where they made the change. And you can't make this up.
Yeah.
Because what happened was, as you gave them more space, you eliminated the cows that had lower production.
Wow.
The low-rank cows got to eat and they got to perform. So I can remember seeing this slide for the first time. Just, you've made this up. This is fake. But this was real farm, real situation, and battling what we were doing at the time, which was overstocked 3-row pens with mattresses. Yeah, in a lot of these dairies. But the clincher was Julie Hussey's work. Again, working at British Columbia, doing proper science, and they were working with these feed bins, these Incentec feed bins. But those things are expensive.
Yeah.
You know, they measure feed intake in cows in groups, in freestall groups, in a close-up pen. But cows were sharing those bins, so there was competition for that feed space in those studies.
So it was overstocked at the feed.
At the feed, yeah. Not in the lying area. And she was tracking cows and monitoring dry matter intake, and then seeing whether they got metritis or not. So metritis is the disease they're getting at, out here 5 days in milk. But she then knew what their dry matter intake was before calving. So the healthy cows went through transition with a little blip, little notch in dry matter intake around calving time, and then they just marched on.
As expected.
As expected. The severe metritis cows out here were sick 5 days of milk. And a sick cow's going to eat less.
Yep.
So we completely expect this decrease in dry matter intake compared to the normal cows here.
Mm-hmm.
But she was able to show that these cows were already eating less before they calved, before they were sick.
A slow decline.
Slow decline. So these are the cows that were really getting negatively impacted in a competitive situation. So these are not sick at this point. They're just eating less. So when you look at an average day, same lines, but focusing on the cows that went on to develop metritis, what they were doing in the weeks before calving were not getting to the bunk when the fresh feed was delivered. So they were eating less at the peak, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And she was able to show that they didn't go back and eat more in between the feed deliveries.
So are you saying that because we were limiting that bunk space, we're making the cows sick?
Yeah, there's probably some other things going on, but feed space was important. Yeah. In that intervening time, that red line, the severe metritis cows did not eat more than the normal cows here and here. So they're not compensating for that lost intake. They ultimately eat less, and that puts them under tremendous stress going through the transition period, and probably part of the reason why they develop metritis. So that was the killer, because it really said that we have to develop these facilities where all the cows can eat at the same time.
Yep.
And that means 2-row pens. We can't do that in a 3-row pen unless we have lots of crossovers.
Yeah, I was going to say lots of wide crossovers.
So, and that's why we're strong proponents of 2-row pens before and after calving in this critical risk period.
Mm-hmm.
Can you do well with 3-row pens?
I'm sure there are some managers that can make
They
it work.
manage their way through it. They push up feed. They deliver feed more frequently. They do the things that you need to do, but you make it so much easier if you can allow the cows to eat at the same time.
Yeah.
So we know now, since that time, that lack of feed space has negative impacts on milk components because the cows saw the adaptations to feeding behavior, i.e. cows decreasing their feeding time, eating more quickly, consuming fewer larger meals, negatively impact rumen function. That change in rumen activity impacts de novo fatty acid production, impacts NEFAs, non-esterified fatty acids, and insulin resistance during transition. A lot of bad stuff for cows.
Yeah, and this is very reminiscent of a slide that you pulled up during the overstocking, so now it just reiterates not only lactating cows, but also our transition cows have these differences in feeding behavior.
Exactly, and again, just to go back to lactating cows, our knowledge of the impact of lameness and the ability of a lame cow not only to compete for a place to lie down, but also a place to eat. They spend less time eating, eat fewer larger meals. It negatively impacts their performance as well. So lameness emerged as a problem for our transition cows. A lame cow in transition has a terrible time. At the same time, there were also folks looking at behavior during that critical period immediately around birth. The isolation seeking, the restlessness, the decrease in feed intake. And this was from our friend Katie Proudfoot, who was at Ohio at the time, was formerly at UBC, and then went on to Prince Edward Island. And she really made us think about this concept of a quiet place to calve, a quiet, stress-free place where cows can be undisturbed, and also within the group shield themselves from other dominant cows. And at the time, again, all those freestall barns that were being built in the late 90s, early 2000s, do you remember where the calving pens were?
I feel like they were really close to the milking parlor, holding
we
area.
put them next to the holding area.
Because why not? I mean, that's where everybody's going to see cows calving, right?
Perfectly good reason to do that. Yeah, calving pens, right where all the activity is, right where people can watch them. Terrible idea. What do we do with those spaces now? We store teat dip and foot bath in them. They're just full of, barrels of chemicals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's also, a focus of understanding cow behavior and having an impact on how we go about designing these facilities. So we came up with a blueprint. We said there wasn't a perfect way to build this barn in the same way that there's no perfect ventilation system.
I thought we weren't going to talk about ventilation.
I just snuck it in there. I promised you I would. So this was our blueprint for transition cows. Around 2005, this kind of all came together. We just asked for 4 things: to allow all the cows to eat at the same time, which basically means for Holstein cows providing 30 inches, not 24, 30 inches of bunk space.
75 centimeters.
Yep, of bunk space before and after calving. So that 21 days before and after was our sort of critical focus. It'd be nice if you did it for longer, but try and do it for that period of time. Allow the cows to rest in a comfortable surface, so deep bedding, sand, bedded packs, not have to sort of deal with hard mats and mattresses during this period. Allow all the cows to rest at the same time, so that impacts our stall stocking density, as well as our feed space, but also our square footage per cow.
So not to go over 100% stocking density.
Exactly, and minimize regrouping stress. And the focus here was on that critical period in the week before calving. So trying not to move the cow between groups before calving in that week before. So that was our blueprint.
It still is our blueprint.
It still is. We've added a few things to it, but that was the element of what we were asking people to do. And what we were doing at the same time was developing an index called the Transition Cow Index, which was a measure of early lactation milk as an outcome of transition. And in the next episode, we'll show how we kind of use that to justify the building of facilities that you just put dry cows in, which until that time, we did not do that.
Yeah, I'm guessing there was very little investment.
If you built a barn, bankers wanted a lactating cow in it. But we changed the approach, and we got purpose-built transition cow facilities put together for the first time. And so we'll get onto that in our next episode.
Awesome.
Performance indicators. Where was the industry? What's it done since? So I pulled these data from our friends at AgSource. They run DHI for Wisconsin and other regions of the US. And so this is comparing 2012 with 2022, which is the sort of most recent data we have available to us. And these numbers, they kind of blow me away in terms of what the industry's been able to do over that period. Remember, a lot of changes had happened before 2012, so we were already kind of going in the right direction.
But is 2012 kind of like a pivotal year?
Just data available at the time,
okay.
When we were really just starting to kind of get it all together. But in that 10-year period, these herds have added 9 pounds of milk.
Impressive.
Yeah, about 9 pounds of milk per cow per day.
Yeah.
Phenomenal kind of improvement in production. But at the same time, it's not just white water that runs downhill. It's got butter, fat, and protein in it. Yeah. So we've added 0.4 on butterfat and 0.1 on protein.
Impressive.
So the energy corrected milk or the fat corrected milk or the components in this milk have also improved around that time.
Okay.
And if you're a genomics researcher, you're just terribly excited to see these numbers, and you're going to say, this is all genomics. It's got to be some of it.
Yeah.
I do believe there is genetic improvement in the cows that
I'm sure the nutritionists are going to say improvements in the diet.
And I would say, if you're a nutritionist, absolutely there have been improvements in the way we feed.
But if you're a housing guy like you? We
might say there's a little bit of cow comfort in here as well. So hopefully all these things working together have improved these. We've dropped average days in milk, Courtney, because we got rid of BST in this time period.
Yep.
And so there's a sort of critical element here where BST, bovine growth hormone, disappeared from our industry. We still added 9 pounds of milk.
Impressive.
And got rid of BST. How did we do it? Part of it was also shifting the days in milk of the herd by breeding more efficiently. How did we do that? Synchronization. These breeding programs got really good.
Yeah.
double off sync, extra PGs. They really know what they're doing with these kind of timed AI approaches now. So we were able to shift the herd earlier days in milk, and when you do that, you get to a higher point in the lactation curve, and you average more milk per cow per day. So improvements in repro. You see that here with a 9-point increase in preg rate.
Not bad.
Pregnancy rate used to be, we used to think 18, this was the best herds here. 18 was pretty good. Now, we're, if you're below 25, there's a problem.
Yeah.
So huge improvement in pregnancy rate as a result of, I think, understanding the physiology behind estrus and being able to manipulate that with these breeding programs. Not all due to hormones. We're using activity monitoring. We've got better systems for that to be able to utilize that when cows are showing heat. But certainly the synchronization programs have done a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
We've improved somatic cell count. Somatic cell count's gone down under 200,000. And then we come to some things that haven't changed much. We've dropped age at first calving a little bit by about a month, from 24 to 23 months typically in our high producing herds. Turnover rate hasn't changed a bit. Still 36% on average. And that may be a topic of a future episode, I think, of trying to understand why we haven't shifted turnover rate when so many other things have improved.
Yeah.
Clearly our cows are performing better, they're healthier, and yet we're still turning a third of the herd over every year on average. But we see some improvements in what our transition cow index here is that number where we're looking at how much extra milk the cow produces in early lactation, presented as a 305-day milk. So 400 pounds more milk across the lactation from just better performance in early lactation. So that's a critical element, and I think part of why milk production has also gone up in that time. And our turnover rate in the first 60 days of milk
has decreased?
It's about the same, but it had already gone down before 2012 because we'd been shocked by that 20% number that Steve Stewart showed us, and we were making improvements already in that area there. So I kind of like looking at these numbers. You kind of forget how fast and how much the industry has changed.
Yeah, we're continuously improving.
Absolutely. It's just a moving target. How much will it continue to improve over the next 10 years?
And we'll come back in 10 years.
We'll come back.
I'm guessing you'll redo this.
We'll do the slide, yeah. So it's been a fascinating journey, and I think understanding cow behavior and understanding the changes that cow goes through transition has had a part to play in these improvements. And certainly our herds now value these dedicated transition cow facilities and doing it right. And in the next episode, we'll talk about the elements that make transition cow facilities work.
I'm looking forward to it, Dr. Cook.
Thanks for joining us.
The Dairyland Initiative is supported by industry leaders who are advancing cow comfort worldwide. We would like to say a special thank you to our premier sponsor, Saputo, who is providing the global community with high-quality dairy products made from high-quality milk from healthy and well-cared-for animals. We'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsors, SaveCows.com, Zinpro, GPS Dairy Consulting, 40 Barn, SureGain Trout Nutrition, Munters, J&D Manufacturing, VES Artex, Ventec, and Kestrel Instruments. Thanks for tuning in to the Dairyland Initiative podcast. Want more Dairyland Initiative? Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, follow us on our socials, and visit our website for all of the latest recommendations in dairy cattle housing and management. See you next time.